Beautiful Swimmers, Watermen, Crabs in the Chesapeake Bay. Written by William Warner. Copyright 1976. This is a special book to me personally, having spent a lot of my childhood on the northern neck, that peninsula between the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers on the Chesapeake Bay at my grandmother and grandfather's house. Johnny and Charles Tillman Boyd. And this book, this actual copy of the book that you see the cover of right now, dilapidated as it is, I discovered it in a closet as we were cleaning out my grandparents' house after my grandmother had passed away several years ago. And there's an inscription on the inside. This book was given to my grandfather by my Aunt Patrice, and she'd written on the inside cover of the book, "To the best watermen she knew," and that was her dad. And so this book has some historic value to me and my family personally, and I hope that it, if you're familiar with the Bay, adds to that sense of home and mystery and specialness of this place. And if not, I hope it introduces you to this interesting and rather historic estuary, the largest in North America. Chapter 1. The Bay. It is so known through the length and breadth of its watershed, the Bay. There is no possible confusion with any other body of water, no need for more precise description. It is, after all, the continent's largest estuary. Its waters are rich, the main supply of oysters, crabs, clams, and other seafoods for much of the Atlantic seaboard. Its shorelines cradled our first settlements. It is the Chesapeake. North to south, from the choppy wavelets of the Susquehanna Flats to the rolling surges of the Virginia Capes, the Bay measures almost exactly 200 miles. Alone among its vital statistics, its breadth is not impressive. The extremes are 4 miles near Annapolis and about 30 miles near the mouth of the Potomac River. In all else, the Bay is champion. Its shoreline is prodigious. Put together, the great rivers on its western shore, the York, the James, the Susquehanna, and the Potomac. Add the labyrinthine marshes of the eastern shore, always capitalized, since it is a land unto itself. The combined shorelines string out to about 4,000 miles, or more than enough to cross the country at its widest. Some say the figure doubles if all tributaries are followed beyond the reach of the tide. The Bay's entire watershed extends north through Pennsylvania to the Finger Lakes and Mohawk Valley country of New York, by virtue of the Susquehanna, the mother river that created the Bay in Pleistocene time. To the west, it traces far back into the furrowed heartland of Appalachia, but one mountain ridge short of the Ohio-Mississippi River drainage, by agency of the Potomac. To the east, the flatland rivers of the eastern shore rise from gum and oak thickets almost within hearing distance of the pounding surf of the Atlantic Barrier Islands. To the south, Bay waters seep through wooded swamps to the North Carolina Sounds, where palmettos, alligators, and great stands of bald cypress first appear. To qualify as an estuary, a body of water must be well enclosed, provide easy entry and exit for open seawater, and enjoy a vigorous infusion of fresh water from one or more rivers. These are minimum requirements. The fjords of Norway are estuaries, but they are uniformly rocky, deep, and thus biologically impoverished, which is why Norwegian fishermen spend most of their time on offshore banks. A good estuary with high biological productivity requires other things. Shallow water for one, which the sun can penetrate to nourish both plankton and rooted aquatic plants. Extensive marshland is another. An estuary without it lacks the lacework of tidal creeks and shallow coves which trap nutrients and protect and feed the larvae and juveniles of a host of fish and invertebrates. Also, to be summa cum laude in estuarine productivity, there must be circulation. A good mix, one is tempted to say, is almost everything. Not just in one direction. There should be two-layered or horizontal circulation, in which heavier salt water from the ocean slides under the lighter and fresher surface water from rivers. Inexorably, that is, with a net flow upstream on the bottom and downstream on the top, which surmounts the temporary effects of wind and tide. Ideally, there should also be some vertical mixing, which is not found in every estuary, since it requires significant contrast in depths and water temperatures. By all tests, the Chesapeake does well. Its very configuration, its long north-south axis, encourages and concentrates horizontal or two-layered circulation. The result is a splendid salinity gradation, or to be more exact, 25 parts salt per thousand of water down near the Virginia Capes, which is almost to ocean, to 0 or freshwater at the northern or upper end of the bay. Freshwater infusion is constant and indeed vigorous. Often, in fact, it is too much of a good thing, as when the rivers of the western shore rise in spring floods. Mightiest of these is the Susquehanna, the longest river of the eastern seaboard. Next in order along the bay's western shore come the Potomac, James, Rappahannock, York, and Patuxent. We must note these next in rank carefully because each is a considerable estuary in its own right, which replicates the salinity gradients of the bay. The York, although at the smaller end of the scale, is a good example. Water lapping the beaches below Yorktown's historic heights is unmistakably salt, of 17 to 20 parts per thousand. Only 30 miles upstream, it is completely fresh. Vertical mixture takes place thanks mainly to a deep channel running almost the total length of the bay. Geomorphologically speaking, it is the fossilized bed of the ancient Susquehanna. It lies at the bottom of the bay at depths of 80 to 120 feet, still well defined after 15,000 years of silting and sedimentation. In its first life, it was the course of an upstart river searching and scouring its way to the sea, nourished by Pleistocene glaciers not far to the north. As glaciers melted in the post-Pleistocene, rising ocean waters drowned the river valley to create the bay much as we know it now. Today's ships' captains running to Baltimore know the old river well. It is the route of seagoing commerce. Trouble is in store for those who don't or who ignore the pilot's warnings. Its shoulders are sharp, and sure stranding attends any deviation from course. To the bay's host of marine organisms, the fossil river is equally important. In late summer and early fall, fresh seawater, fresh in the sense of oxygen content, creeps in along its bottom and branches up the tributaries with unusual strength, since rivers are low and their obstructing flow weak. Above it lies tired or biologically exhausted water. All summer long, the surface waters have supported immense communities of plankton, not to mention sometimes harmful algae, greedily consuming oxygen. Now these waters are oxygen starved, but it is autumn and they are cooling more rapidly than the deep water below. Being heavier, they sink. Conversely, the intruding seawater below carrying fresh oxygen slowly begins to rise. The mix is thus two-way. In the process, the microscopic plant and animal plankton, heavily concentrated near the surface in summer, are swirled up and down and thus distributed more uniformly. Some of the bay's most prominent year-round residents, the blue crab, the striped bass, the white perch, take their cue and make rapidly for the deeps. There they can feed amid the deeper groves of plankton and enjoy warmer water as autumn slowly turns to winter. Theoretically, oysters and clams would do well to follow suit, but locomotion, alas, is not within their powers. Crabs especially appreciate the deep water in autumn, since it prolongs the time left to them before cold water will force virtual hibernation in the post-Pleistocene ooze. The Great Channel is therefore a winter haven, a place for rest and limited feeding, free of the temperature extremes of surface waters. In spring, vertical mixing again takes place through reversal of the autumn factors. Reoxygenation starts at the surface. In response, the fish ascend, and the crabs start a slow and measured crawl up out of the channel. The crab's eventual goal is the shoal areas where eelgrass abounds, and where the new spring water courses over the shallows with every tide. They go there to hide and to feed and to feel the rays of the warming sun, and think about other things associated with spring. Feller hasn't run ashore. He don't know much this bay, a waterman once said to me after he pulled my catch off a tenacious sandbar. It was the nicest thing anyone could possibly say under such embarrassing circumstances, and it made me feel much better. What he meant, of course, is that the Chesapeake does not lack for the shallow water that is another prime estuarine requirement. The average depth of the Chesapeake, mother river and tributary channels included, is 21 feet. For most of the bay, 15 feet or less would be a better figure. Shallower still are vast areas along the eastern shore, the waters surrounding the great Marsh Islands of Tangier Sound, for example, which Captain John Smith called the Isles of Limbo, where vigorous sounding will fail to uncover anything deeper than 5 feet. Captain Smith was glad when he left, and today's less venturesome sailors shun the marshy islands like the plague. Yet these very shoal waters have their place, if not for yachtsmen. They provide an optimum habitat for such rooted aquatic plants as wild celery and widgeon grass, the choice of waterfowl, or eelgrass and sea lettuce, which, although acceptable to ducks and geese, are only preferred by small fish, crabs, and young seed oysters. Almost invariably, the shoals supporting these water plants are bordered by marsh. The marshlands in turn support a much greater growth of plants which want to have their roots covered by water some of the time, but cannot tolerate it all the time. Dominating these, heavily outweighing all other species in sheer tonnage and outdistancing them in distribution, are the spiky spartinas, or cordgrasses. Spartina patens, that is, which ripples in windrows or lies in natural cowlicks on the firmer ground, and Spartina alterniflora, taller and denser, which grows on the quaking mud banks and along creek borders, first invaded by tidewater. The interaction between the two plant communities, one just below the water and the other barely above, is admirable. The marsh grasses are the storehouse or granary. The agents that mill them and their associated plant and animal life, principally algae and insects, are death and decay. We cannot readily see the crop so produced, since it ultimately takes the form of pinhead particles of detritus and bacteria-manufactured nutrients dissolved in the water. But it beggars anything that happens on dry land. Most of the Chesapeake's marshlands produce an average annual yield of 5 tons of vegetation per acre. Those in the southern reaches along the lower eastern shore go as high as 10. Down every tidal gut and through every big thoroughfare and little swash or drain, as the breaks in the Marsh Islands are called, there comes an enormous and nourishing flow of silage made from this decomposing Spartina crop. Waiting to receive the flow, well protected by wavy forests of eelgrass, are many forms of life. First recipients are plankton, and the larvae and young of larger forms, who need it most. In the latter category are enormous infant populations of fish, clams, oysters, jellyfish, and worms. Predominant among adult forms are the blue crabs, who have a fine time of it preying on the small fry, including sometimes some of their own. The animals of the aquatic plant communities give something back to the marsh in return, although not as much as they receive. Since they consume great quantities of marsh-produced nutrients, they also therefore release considerable amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus after their rapid browse feeding and digestion. The waters so fertilized return to the marshes twice every 24 hours, as sure as the moon and sun make tides. The same waters, of course, also bring salt, which is what permits the cordgrass to reign as uncontested monarchs of the marshland. Alone in the plant kingdom, the Spartinas thrive on it, or more accurately, despite it. Thus, interaction. Most of the Chesapeake Spartina marsh is concentrated on the lower eastern shore in a broad belt extending south from Maryland's Little Choptank River. South of the Little Choptank, the watermen tell you, the fast land disappears. It is their way of saying that only isolated islands or small clumps of firm ground dot the vast marsh landscape of these parts. The larger islands are called hammocks. Often they support whole fishing villages or considerable growth of pine and hardwoods. The smaller ones, with barely enough soil to nourish a single bush or tree, are dismissed as tumps. Seen from the air, the region appears very much like an Everglades of the north. It is the largest undisturbed marshland in the mid-Atlantic states. Undisturbed because it is far from ocean beaches and thus largely overlooked by developers. May it remain so. Such are the bay's estuarine assets, Each makes its contribution, and together they combine to produce marketable marine resources of incredible volume. The Maryland portion of the bay alone produces more oysters than any other state in the Union, with an annual harvest of approximately 3 million bushels. Jurisdiction of the Chesapeake is divided. Virginia controls 985 square miles of bay waters, and Maryland 703. Together, the two bay states supply 1/4 of the United States oyster catch, worth about $22 million dockside. Since its inception in the 1950s, the bay's soft or steamer clam industry has provided over half the national catch of this species, moving all of New England to second rank. But it is in the stocks of the familiar Atlantic blue crab that the bay's bounty stretches belief. No body of water in the world has been more intensively fished for crabs than the Chesapeake, nor for a longer period with such successful result. Since its beginning in the mid-19th century, the bay's blue crab fishery has made the United States the leading crab-consuming nation of the world, followed closely by Japan only in recent years. The national catch of all species annually averages anywhere from 250 to 350 million round weight, or whole crab pounds, worth approximately 80 million. Crabs are thus our fourth most valuable fishery, exceeded only by shrimp, salmon, and tuna. The blue crab regularly provides 50% of this national crab catch. Second in domestic rankings is the Alaska king crab, which has come rapidly into vogue since World War II. Other popular market species include the famed Dungeness crab of the Pacific coast and the Alaskan tanner or snow crab. Perhaps almost as tasty as these, although taken in much less numbers, are the Florida stone crab and the rock and Jonah crabs of Maine. Blue crabs are now fished commercially from Delaware Bay down the Atlantic seaboard to Florida and around into the Gulf Coast as far as Louisiana and Texas. The biggest catch by far comes from the Chesapeake Bay. The bay annually offers up anywhere from 50 to 80 million pounds in poor years and good years respectively, or approximately half the total catch of the species. This means that anywhere from 150 to 240 million individual blue crabs are removed from the bay waters each year, since the average market specimen weighs 1/3 of a pound. Not only that, our dependence on the Chesapeake for the succulent soft crab is almost total, or 95% of the national catch in this form. This is not a matter of biology or habitat, but human industry. Skill, hard work, and infinite patience are required to hold crabs in floats or pens until they molt and successfully bring them live to market. People in other places don't want to do it. Only the core sound area of North Carolina, where early season softs are a short-term specialty prior to the opening of the shrimp season, and certain localities in Florida and the Gulf states, where there is a local restaurant trade, are exceptions. Practically speaking, therefore, but for the strong work ethic of Chesapeake watermen, this most delectable form of crab would never come to market. As might be expected, the Chesapeake's grand mixtures of fresh and salt water are also ideal for anadromous fishes, or those who spend part of their life in the sea and part far up estuaries for spawning and early growth. Most prized by both sport and commercial fishermen is the striped bass, always called rockfish in the Bay Country. Here again, honors go to Maryland. Its fresher half of the bay regularly leads all other states with an annual catch of 4 to 5 million pounds. There is yet another record of sorts among the anadromous fishes that is often forgotten, since the catch has dwindled to relative insignificance. Searching here and there in the fresh fish shops of Tidewater, Virginia, one occasionally finds giant slabs of glistening meat, lightly marbled with yellow fat. It is not swordfish, as size might first suggest, but sturgeon. The annual catch is around 17,000 pounds. Dockside values seldom exceeds 3,000, or barely enough to rate mention in the Department of Commerce's Logorrhea of Fishery reports. Before the turn of the century, catches of over 1 million pounds, from which 100,000 pounds of caviar might be extracted, were not uncommon. There is a message here. The bay has other treasures, not all at the head of lists. Enormous herring runs, sufficient to support a sizable canning industry, and provide the herring roe Virginians like to eat for breakfast with scrambled eggs. Mink, muskrat, nutria, and otter, sad to include, trapped in the lovely marshes of Maryland's Dorchester County, in number second only to Louisiana. Sky-darkening flocks of migrating and wintering waterfowl in the thickest concentrations of the Atlantic flyway. Enough superlatives. They mislead. The Chesapeake does not impress those who know it best as the grandest or most of anything. For all its size and gross statistics, it is an intimate place where land and water intertwine in infinite varieties of mood and pattern. None has captured the essential bay better than its principal discoverer, Captain John Smith. After rounding the sand dunes of Cape Charles and Henry, he wrote, A fair bay compassed but for the mouth with fruitful and delightsome land. Within is a country that may have the prerogative over the most pleasant places of Europe, Asia, Africa, or America, for large and pleasant navigable rivers. Heaven and earth never agreed better to frame a place for man's habitation. Although more than one historian has called the doughty explorer America's first press agent, none has seriously suggested that he was far off the mark in his description of the Chesapeake. It is true, of course, that ice occasionally grips the bay and winter storms are not unknown. The summer thunder squalls and sometimes waterspouts are notorious. A prominent yachtsman who has sailed the world oceans once told me he had never been so taken by surprise, dragged anchor farther, or felt more helpless than when hit by a fast-moving thunderstorm off Oxford, Maryland, in the month of July. But for most of the time, the mood of the bay is gentle and charitable. There are no rocks to claw or rend ship bottoms, tidal range is slight, and currents, when found, are more a refreshing diversion than an obstacle. Fog is rare. Caught in an autumn gale, the prudent skipper knows that he need only run a short distance before the storm to find a wide choice of snug, completely enclosed anchorages, where gallery forests of pine and oak come down to the water's edge, and where geese and wild swans still fly over at masthead height with every dawn. Delightsome, fruitful, pleasant. So it is, most would say, to this day.